Spider-Man, Spider-Man, married to Gwen, but he is still sad. Mary Jane is doing well. Without him, man, that's not swell. Time to cry, cause he's mopey Spider-Man. The following is an in-depth story analysis and retrospective. If you haven't read this book, you might want to before watching this review. It's the 10th anniversary of Geekvolution, and I thought it was time to try something brand new with Superhero Rewind. If you've only ever followed that series, you might not know that I've reviewed more comics by far than superhero movies. It helps that most of those reviews are unscripted. But from the very beginning, I've considered doing comic reviews in this format, and I've just never tried it. Rewind has always been about movies, but it's also mostly been about superheroes. So I thought it was high time I finally tried polished, in-depth story analysis on some of the source material a lot of the movies are drawing from. Not that every story I do here has to be one that's been directly adapted into a film or used to influence a TV show. This one hasn't been borrowed from too much directly yet. But I wanted to talk about some of the same characters and ideas I've discussed from the screen in the medium they originally lived in, and talk about some of the unique storytelling advantages comics have and the unique challenges Marvel and DC especially have in delivering complete stories that are also part of a grander universe. I've talked a lot about how movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are standalone adventures, but often also serve as the next chapter in a sprawling, ongoing narrative. How The Avengers is the first movie in that franchise, but also serves as Iron Man 2.5, Captain America 1.5, Black Widow 0.8, etc. Now that we're past Endgame, it feels even more like comic book storytelling, in that there's a lot of stuff you're just gonna have to know going in that each movie, especially the big event movies, aren't gonna have time to recap for you. Most big superhero stories, certainly from the big two publishers, are like this, except there's a lot more continuity to keep track of. In a lot of cases, decades and decades of it. It can be really daunting for new readers to jump on board and have a good sense of what's going on. Even a brand new monthly title that just started at number 1. Sometimes the story is self-contained enough you don't need to know anything going in to at least get the major beats, like some of my favorite events, such as Batman No Man's Land and Infinity Gauntlet. And sometimes the event just builds so much on what's come before it, it isn't really a new story in and of itself, but an extension of a much longer story that's been told over several titles and sometimes even other events, like Abnett and Lanning's Guardians of the Galaxy. And some events have their cake and eat it too, only existing because of other stories that inform them, but creatively finding ways to make themselves good jumping on points. Blackest Night is the culmination of everything that was happening with Jeff Johns' Green Lantern at that point, but I had never read a Green Lantern comic and found it almost totally accessible. When new readers are overwhelmed and horrified they're going to waste their hard-earned cash on books they can't follow because of years of prerequisite they don't have the money or time to read, I always suggest just picking a character or two you're interested in and stick around for several issues. Right now, whatever the story is, and usually you'll pick up on enough background through story context to keep up, kind of like learning the basics of a language and then learning the rest by throwing yourself into the culture. While most superhero movie universes obviously have their share of continuity mistakes and retcons, Fox's X-Men couldn't keep everything straight after just 2 movies, comics are more complicated because A, there's a lot more history, especially with Marvel, which has more or less retained its continuity without a full-on reboot since it began in the early 60s. And no, Secret Wars wasn't the New 52-sized reboot we were led to believe it was, for better or worse. B, what counts and what doesn't is predicated on each new creative team. Sometimes they're respectful to what was done right before them and they do their best not to contradict it, like Nick Spencer and his treatment of Dan Slott's 10-year Spider-Man run before his, and sometimes they like to ignore the guys before them completely. And C, there's simply a lot more of it, and it's impossible to read everything. I mention all of that in this overly long introduction to say that major comic stories and crossover events will be challenging to tackle in the Rewind format because, first, I don't know comics nearly as well as I know superhero movies, try as I might. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for years, but there's infinitely more history to keep track of, and I just can't remember everything. And B, we're almost never looking at a complete story, even if on the surface it might look that way. Exceptions to this include self-contained graphic novels like The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. While informed by stories that came before, they exist in their own worlds and are the first things in those continuities. And there are out-of-continuity things, like Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe or Marvel Zombies, that are like that as well, even though things like that have sequels. Everything's got sequels. But the big crossover events and major tentpole stories, which are primarily what I want to cover here, just can't function completely as a singular piece by their very nature. I could pick a company and start from the beginning, review all the big stuff in order, but I think we'd all get bored with that pretty quickly, especially since this is an occasional side series and I'm not putting these out all the time. So I'm going to skip around, just like I do with other rewinds, for the sake of variety, and because I want to examine these as singular stories as much as I can, again, recognizing that they're also almost always part of a greater whole. But I want to do that because most of us read them as their own thing, or at least without knowing everything that informs them. The reason Marvel and DC put out so many crossovers, of course, many of them advertised as bombshells that will change the face of the Marvel or DC universe, is of course because they tend to sell a lot better than regular ongoing titles. The top book usually sells between 100,000 and 200,000 copies, sometimes better. Whatever the big yearly event is almost guaranteed to do those numbers, no matter what it is. Most comic readers will buy them, even begrudgingly, because that's where the major ground-shifting stuff happens. And if you miss that, it's harder to appreciate what's happening in Batman or Spider-Man or the Avengers. And readers who want the broad strokes of the history of the universe will read what they've heard is the important stuff and totally out of context. So people feel the need to check out Death of Superman and Civil War and Planet Hulk, because they've heard of those things, and they know they established the status quo in other stuff they want to look at, much like Endgame did for Spider-Man Far From Home. So I want to see which of these stories can really be read without a lot of context, and regardless of whether you're reading anything else from that era. Which ones, though informed by what came before, are more or less accessible to a reader with a basic knowledge of those characters, or provides enough in-story recap that you can get by without it. Which of these events are telling real stories, beginning, middle, and end? And which ones are just concerned with transitioning the universe to its next phase? Which events are really about something, and really about characters who want something, have an opportunity for change along their quest for that thing? And which ones are just the novelty of putting a bunch of superheroes together punching stuff? House of M is an interesting book to start with, requested by Malik Myers on Patreon, because it's a little of column A and a little of column B. Written by Brian Michael Bendis and drawn by Olivier Coipel in 2005, it's a follow-up to Avengers Disassembled, and an early entry in a long line of major events that inform each other, including Civil War, which is of course the start of every year there's gotta be a big giant crossover event. And it does its very best to deal with the consequences of Scarlet Witch killing some Avengers in that previous event, to create an earth-shattering and fascinating status quo for Marvel on the whole and mutants in particular, but to stand as a story that doesn't require any prior knowledge of recent events. And it kind of fails at that, though it's a valiant effort, and I appreciate its lack of heavy-handed expository dialogue to recap what's come before, and its natural sense of visual cinematic storytelling. Bendis lets the art drive a lot of the story here, and he's at his most concise, most focused, and most down to business. He's juggling a lot of ideas and story points and mythology here, and for a man with a reputation for meandering, for issues and developing plenty of character while getting nowhere with his plot, he packs an awful lot in these 8 issues, which is impressive. His trademark believable and colorful dialogue is here in spades. Each character certainly comes alive, but the story isn't as driven by their actions as it wants to be, and it does fall into that classic event trap. At the end of the day, even though the ideas are really interesting, and some of these characters have fascinating motivations and ideas, what happens is driven more by where the story wants to be at the end than by characters' actions. But it almost convinces me that's not the case until I start breaking it down. House of M is a moody, sometimes chilling piece about how incompatible power can be with the human condition, about how people thrive under conflict and pain, about how difficult it is to reconcile absolute freedom and absolute safety, and how impossible it is to make all people happy. It has a melancholy atmosphere about it that's not exactly like anything else I've read. It's a risky book that's not afraid, for better or worse, to take beloved characters to dark, seemingly irredeemable places to tell its story and to push the envelope of what you can do in a mainstream superhero comic, without completely alienating your audience and destroying what makes people love this universe. Although some people will argue that's exactly what Bendis did with this story. I, for one, appreciate that it's not stuck in a superhero formula, but he walks that line very finely. And it creates a fresh and interesting alternate universe that's fun to explore and thought-provoking in comparing it to what's good and bad about the regular universe it's born out of. This is basically an in-universe what-if that, for my money, would have been better served as an out-of-continuity what-if, but stretched over several issues, like Marvel Zombies, and like what I wanted from the world of Flashpoint. What if Magneto won and humans were second-class citizens, subservient to mutants who set themselves up as superior as the literal next step in human evolution? I think it suffers from two premises that are at odds with each other. Magneto wins and everyone gets the life they always wanted. And I think it suffers from not having a central protagonist, and from being structured around major players that only bookend the book, but still feel like the characters it's really about by the end. The central conflict that leads to the creation of Magneto's mutant utopia is the question of what to do with Wanda after she's killed 3 Avengers, Hawkeye, Ant-Man, and Vision. Is mentally unstable and has reality-altering powers she could accidentally use to blink out everyone on the planet if she had the wrong stray thought. The new Avengers and the X-Men meet to discuss her fate, and while no one wants to kill her, several of the X-Men think it's the only way to ensure she won't hurt anyone else. And even Magneto seems to agree. That dilemma is made more real for the reader by Wanda's altering reality to bring back her twins at the beginning. Baby Xavier says she can't have and shouldn't exist. Right away, she's scary. She's out of control and can will anything into existence or disappear anything out of existence. A severely mentally ill person gets to decide what is and what is not. It's Xavier's ultimate fear. The mutant that proves humans right who don't think mutants and humans can coexist. And ironically, she's Magneto's daughter. Magneto who believes the opposite. That there shouldn't be any coexistence because mutants are superior to humans and shouldn't be controlled at all. This is the worst possible place for the superheroes to be in. The greatest threat to the world is one of their own, and to save it, to be heroes, they might have to kill a fellow Avenger, and in the X-Men's case, a fellow mutant. It's a fantastic, dramatic situation. First, it's personal for both teams, and that forces the Avengers to have to deal with the same thing the X-Men do on a daily basis. It's the perfect encapsulation of the mutant rights dilemma, a metaphor for civil rights, of course, but one with a less clear-cut answer, because superpowers can, in fact, be harmful and are significantly different from superficial genetic differences like skin color or hair thickness. There is maybe an argument to be made for superiority. How do you keep the world safe from dangerous mutants, people who can't control their powers, without treating them as less than, without compromising their human rights? The Avengers and the X-Men fight together every so often in events like Secret Wars, and had even fought each other in X-Men vs. the Avengers in the 80s, not to be confused with the 12-part Avengers vs. X-Men event in 2012. But by and large, the X-Men tended to function as a separate entity, like it was cordoned off in its own pocket of the Marvel Universe. Bigotry and intolerance against mutants didn't tend to come up in anything that wasn't an X title unless it was a major story point. So this was a natural way to force those two worlds to collide, and to create an interesting argument about whose decision this should be. Wanda is a founding Avenger, but she's also Magneto's daughter. Whose responsibility and whose right is it to determine her fate? When it comes to how much you need to know coming into this event, ignorance is kind of bliss. The first time I read this, I didn't feel like I was out of the loop at all. It seemed like Bendis provided enough context to set up his story, and pretty effortlessly. But if you start looking at a Scarlet Witch's sordid past, it's not at all what the first issue would lead you to believe it is. Knowing what I know now doesn't change the implications of the story too much. Wanda wants children, she can't have them, and she changes reality so she can give birth to twins. I read that as just an example of her madness, to demonstrate how urgent dealing with her is, but her obsession with having children is actually directly related to her cardinal sins, and that's not mentioned in the book at all. When Xavier says, "You cannot have children, you never could, and they never existed," what he's talking about is way more complicated than a sterile woman who wishes she could conceive. And it was done in the most convoluted, comic booky, X-Men soap opera sort of way. And not even in X-Men. In a nutshell, Wanda couldn't have children with Vision because he's, a robot, so she magicked her kids into existence. Xavier says they never existed because the kids she had turned out to be shards of a demon that were integrated back into said demon, and she became so obsessed with getting them back, she went to Dr. Doom and made a deal with another demon, essentially a deal with the devil to reconstitute them, and that's when she killed those 3 Avengers, because she got possessed by an evil entity. Everybody following this? Just reading this, I thought Wanda killed the other Avengers of her own accord. Maybe not intentionally, but with a stray thought, like she worries she'll have to do here. She is responsible for it in that it was because she couldn't accept what she couldn't have and selfishly tried to break the rules of nature to get her children back. But she was being controlled by another being when it happened. It's not really what I was led to believe it is here. For the sake of this story, though, ignoring all else, it's way simpler, and honestly more compelling, to just assume she wants kids she never had, and that she wasn't demonically possessed when she murdered some of the Avengers, and getting into all of that would have bogged the book way down. It's not a retcon, as Bendis has a reputation for doing a lot of, or just not remembering continuity and then contradicting it. But this feels calculated to me. I'm not sure if Bendis is expecting most readers to know that history, or if he's wanting them to assume different and, for my money, more interesting events, and slyly does it in a way that doesn't contradict what came before, but certainly makes a newcomer perceive things differently. While this dilemma is great, and that first issue is wonderfully haunting, that image of one of Wanda's babies screaming at Xavier with blank white eyes as if to say, "I'm here, don't tell me I don't exist, I want to live," has been burned into my retinas since I first read this. The bulk of the story isn't about what to do with Wanda, but about the solution her brother comes up with, and then how that falls apart. House of M will turn out to sort of be a house of cards, but because of a built-in failsafe that she put in for some reason. She basically makes sure that it falls apart. With a mutant she creates named Layla, who has the very specific ability to see the universe that was before and bring back people's memories to them. Lucky for Wolverine, when he meets Luke Cage and tries to explain that the world has been altered, Cage believes him because Layla has conveniently showed up and already told him everything. Nice that we don't have to wade through pages of Netflix Iron Fist level convincing someone that the seemingly impossible is true, but it's a pretty easy plot device, and I don't fully understand why Wanda put it there, except to help Bendis resolve the story. We're not told how this came to be until the penultimate issue, and it's played sort of as a mystery. We'll all assume it must have been Magneto's idea, since the shifted reality we find after the world goes white in issue 1 sees him as king of an empire, the House of Magnus, lording over a mutant utopia that sees humans as inferior and largely segregates them like African Americans in the 1960s. Although there's no separate but equal pretense. They're just assumed not as good as mutants because mutant powers make them, according to the rhetoric, genetically superior, and because nature seems to be phasing out humanity in favor of mutant kind. Because of how completely self-defeated and remorseful Magneto seems at the beginning, just look at him. Does this look like a guy who's ready to remake the world in his own image? I never bought that he had anything to do with creating the House of M. He's also kept almost completely in the background through the story, which also made me suspicious of that. So even though I didn't call Quicksilver, and I probably should have, considering how distraught Pietro is over the meeting the superheroes are having to decide his sister's fate at the beginning, it wasn't an especially satisfying revelation for me on first read. It seems obligatory, like this is an event, so there needs to be some big shocking twist at the end, and the structure seems manufactured to create that twist, when the story might have been just as compelling if the scene between Wanda and Pietro at the beginning were allowed to continue into the second part of it, that were finally given toward the end, where Pietro comes up with the idea to give everyone what they've always wanted and to use Professor X's powers in conjunction with Wanda's to do it, presumably to focus her ability and to read everyone's mind and find out what they want to order off the everything you've ever wanted menu. And side note, because I don't know where else I'm going to mention this, there's also a mystery about where Professor X is in this universe, because the superheroes need him to try to put the world back together, and it doesn't really go anywhere. Like, the big mission is, we gotta go get Xavier. First it seems like he's dead, then we find there's no body in the grave, then the heroes don't actually do anything to restore the world. Wanda does that after she's confronted by Doctor Strange. So I'm not saying they shouldn't be proactive just because what they're trying to do doesn't ultimately end up saving the world, but the whole thing is just dropped, and Xavier is still missing in the reconstituted world. It's weird not to reveal where he was and why Magneto had a fake gravestone for him in Genosha. Maybe that's revealed somewhere, but not in this book. I like the idea that this world can't exist with Xavier in it, that he has to die so Genosha can live. But why all this intrigue about it when it's just forgotten about by the end? Intrigue that lasts all the way up to the final battle with Magneto's forces at Genosha. So anyway, because of this structure, there's no central protagonist, and that great dilemma set up at the beginning feels like it kind of resolves itself, and creates that new status quo the event was no doubt designed to create: no more mutants. After the superheroes all learn they're in an altered false reality, like Q's anti-time future in the Star Trek The Next Generation finale All Good Things, they rebel against this perfect world and try to find Xavier to set things right. When she's confronted by Doctor Strange and forced to admit that she and Pietro hatched this scheme to try to make up for past sins and so that she won't have to die, Wanda blames Magneto's arrogance and belief in mutant superiority for her problems. But more, she blames the existence of mutants. Interesting that in this world where all of her friends get to live their ostensible perfect life, she's made herself human, casting Magneto as the ruler who projects benevolence by raising one of the common folk as his own, or maybe even as a hypocrite who, like Adolf Hitler, couldn't stay consistent with his own definition of genetic superiority. So she says, no more mutants, and when reality turns to normal, everything is as it was, except most mutants don't have their powers anymore. This is seen as the near annihilation of an entire race of people, even though no one actually died. They've just been reduced to humans, if you see humans and mutants as separate species. And there's a one-shot Aftermath issue, The House of M the Day After, that spends more time with this crisis and sees the mutants who have lost their powers grieving and trying to figure out how they're going to move on. It continues to play up the mystery of why some mutants have their powers and has characters talking more about that, which there wasn't enough of here, and lets us know what major mutants are still mutants and which ones aren't. Were it not for the big cliffhanger ending with attacking Sentinels, I'd say that should have been the ending of the series proper, which is all about the larger implications, how this will affect an ecosystem accustomed to mutants, which I appreciate, but not the more personal introspection. That issue was written by Chris Claremont, who does a great job of staying consistent with the content and tone of the main series, and I couldn't help but wonder how he might have handled writing duties on House of M himself. Wanda is the catalyst for this story, but is also sort of the Deus Ex Machina. Which isn't fair. That's suggesting the story is cheating, like some device comes out of nowhere and fixes everything. But it kind of reads that way, because Wanda isn't a major player throughout the story proper. She bookends the piece, which isn't actually about anyone so much as a bunch of snapshots of what this new world is like, what our heroes might have chosen for themselves in it, and how they all react to discovering what's been done to them. It's presented oddly more like a disaster film than a psychological thriller, which I'd argue is the genre it lends itself most to. I never want to rewrite a story, but the closest thing to a character arc here is for Wanda, who mostly disappears for 6 issues, and for everyone else, it's a standard how do we reverse this disaster plot. And again, they don't really have a lot to do with actually actually reversing the disaster besides Doctor Strange. It might have been more compelling and wouldn't have felt so plot-driven if Wanda was our POV character. I know she's mentally unstable and we wouldn't trust her, but I think this would have been better served as a story about a mentally ill person who wants to redeem herself, wants to do the right thing, who doesn't want the power she's been given, but has been made essentially a god by fate. She gives Magneto what he's always wanted and tries to live in that world as a human so she can't hurt anyone again, but gradually realizes what she's built isn't any better than the world she paved over. Maybe it's even worse. And we see her come to the conclusion that the real problem is mutants. As it reads now, that speech comes out of nowhere. I don't see Wanda's thought process, and so I don't quite understand how she arrives there. Before, it was all about her inability to control her impulses and her obsession with getting her children back, which she, of course, has in the new reality. But after she lives a whole other life off panel, she's suddenly freaking out on Magneto and decides the real solution is to get rid of mutants altogether. It's a really interesting idea. She could just make herself human, and I'm not sure why that's never discussed, considering the only other solution she can come up with is killing herself when she asks Pietro if she's a coward for not doing that, and considering she did make herself human in the other reality. Although, I guess she still had her powers, because she then uses them to restore reality. So maybe the only thing she can't truly affect with her reality-altering abilities is herself. But even if she could, there are still mutants who believe themselves better than humans because of their powers, and Wanda lived in both worlds. She wasn't an X-Man, she was an Avenger. Her closest friends were humans. Maybe she sees herself more as human than mutant, or doesn't even make the distinction. And her husband was an android. This is the most inclusive and least bigoted mutant alive. So if there are no mutants, there can't be that war between the races. At least those races, not to mention mutants can't accidentally hurt the people they care about with their powers. I mean, it makes sense that she would come to that conclusion, and not just because she's a crazy person who would do whatever wild thing comes to her head. In the moment, it reads that way, though, because I don't get in her head. I don't get to see that thought process. I'm not saying this couldn't be a multicast piece with other characters who change and grow through this experience. The story wouldn't necessarily have to be hers alone, but making her either a protagonist or the protagonist would make that ending feel organic and not cheap drama to get us to the way this event changes the face of the Marvel Universe. For a minute, it reads like maybe it's gonna be primarily Wolverine's story, because we're still in the days of X-Men being synonymous with Wolverine. X3 hasn't even come out, and he's still starring in 6 quadrillion comics at the time. He's the only character at first who remembers the previous reality, and at the end of the second issue, after we've already been introduced to this world and gradually discover that mutants are lording over humans, with really effective cinematic scenes that provide context clues, allowing the reader to piece everything together, I should add. Wolverine wakes up and seems to know that something isn't right. As much as I appreciate that issue for not spelling everything out for us, and for the tension of seeing the Marvel Universe through a cracked lens, I wonder why Wolverine isn't our POV character from the start, where we're allowed to piece all this together from his perspective, rather than just jumping around from character to character as if they're protagonists, and then getting to Wolverine, who we kinda have to watch figuring out what we know already. Or at least it feels that way. It's awkward. The reason Wolverine knows about the previous world is because his perfect life is having all of his memories. Loophole! The story is a little vague about what he really knows. I would assume, like all the characters that will get their knowledge of the previous universe back, he has overlapping memories, but then when he talks to Luke Cage in the underground human resistance headquarters, he doesn't seem to understand what's going on in the world. So we follow him as he looks up Xavier's mansion, goes there and finds there's someone living there and that it's not a school. He gets chased by S.H.I.E.L.'s elite Red Guard, of which he's supposed to be the star agent, and we already know a lot of stuff he's about to find out. So it's hard to feel what he's feeling along with him, and it's hard not to get impatient waiting for him to catch up. I think he should have woken up at the beginning of issue 2, and we should have been subjected to this nightmare along with him. Wolverine should have been the Eyes-In character, like he would be a decade later in the film version of Days of Future Past. I appreciate the lack of intrusive text boxes and internal monologue in this book. though some of that would have been warranted if we were primarily following a single POV character. But I never feel like I'm in anyone's heads, except in the bookend issues, and even then, it's only because Wanda, Pietro, Xavier, and Magneto are talking so much about what they're thinking and feeling. Sometimes it feels like this book wants to be a movie more than a comic book. I'm not seeing the world through anyone's eyes, even there, so much as just getting a lot more communication than in the rest of the book. I feel too much like a fly on the wall in a story that's screaming for more character study. And that's not because it's a super action-heavy book either. And there's a lot of talking. Not as much as your average Bendis story, but until issue 6, there's lots of discussion about mutant superiority, that scene between the Hanks where McCoy talks down to Pym, who's trying to isolate the mutant gene, and Beast tells him he can't do it because he's lucky to even be working as a sapien scientist, and the very idea of that research is anti-mutant. That's all heartbreaking and wonderfully illustrates the dynamic between the social classes. There's some talk later, once the superheroes know what's going on, about the morality of changing things back, too. Kitty Pryde asks whether they might just make things worse if they try to put the world back the way it was. And Jessica Drew takes it a step further and asks if maybe this is how it's supposed to be, and if maybe they finally deserve to be happy. More on that in a minute. There's plenty of interesting moralizing and metaphysical debate, although there's some existential stuff I'd have liked to see addressed. Like, is the Hawkeye Wanda wills back into existence the same Hawkeye she killed? And how could anyone really be sure? And why exactly did he survive into the shift back to the original reality? Although that one's maybe answered later, along with why exactly do some mutants get to keep their powers even though Wanda said no more mutants. I haven't read a lot of X-Men and Avengers directly after this. Beyond the obvious answer of course, nobody's gonna buy X-Men comics with no mutant powers in them. But anyway, there's interesting discussion, and these characters often feel real enough, even if I don't sometimes like what Bendis does with them. But they're not protagonists. It's a whole cast of side characters without a lead. And because of that, I'm distanced from everybody, and I'm sometimes frustrated to not know what they're thinking. Some of that is because I don't have a clear sense, just from experiences I've had with these characters before, as to why this is their perfect life, or as perfect as it can be in the same world where Magneto gets his. That has to inform everyone else's desire, because if he gets what he wants, he's king of the country. And that seems to be the priority for Pietro, too, who came up with this idea, because he wants his sister and his father and him to be a family again. I get why Captain America isn't frozen in ice and gets to live to be an old man. That's perfect for everything I understand about that character. He's a man out of time, never felt like he fit in the present. He and Peggy Carter probably got to grow old together, just like in Endgame. Maybe this is even where the Russos got that idea. Wolverine knowing everything about his life before Weapon X also makes sense, and I get that he thrives on violence, but would he really want to be a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent taking orders from Shaw, of all people, a part of a systematically racist government that persecutes humans? He might not have agreed with Xavier's dream before he met him, but the idea here isn't putting everyone where they'd be if Magneto got his way. Like, if you went back in time and changed events to make the timeline look like this, it's giving everyone what they want simultaneously as much as possible. The Wolverine that is an X-Man, I wouldn't think would want this life. And so I really need some discussion from these characters about how they feel about the way Wanda interpreted their perfect life. Are they surprised? Embarrassed? Worried about what it says about some of them? Rogue is also a ruthless agent who kills humans somewhat indiscriminately and doesn't seem to mind still not being able to touch another person without hurting them. I'd think she'd be a human or have a different power in this world. And why not? Wanda returned Wolverine's memories and was human herself, at least until Doctor Strange got to her. Luke Cage's secret best life is to run an underground resistance in a world that hates his kind. I like the idea that some people are only happy swimming in conflict. And Matrix idea that people won't accept the world of perfect bliss. But that seems a little extreme to me. I could see him running Heroes for Hire or something, and he seems like a good candidate to run a resistance movement if it were called for. But for that to be where he'd be happiest, even in this world, I could maybe be led to believe it, but I need to get his perspective on it, once he knows who he is in the old world. And the weirdest one is Spider-Man. In fact, a lot of things about Spider-Man are bizarre in House of M. Whether you're in Camp Stacy or Camp Watson, Peter's perfect life being married to Gwen Stacy, the version of Peter who has been through everything he has with his wife, just rubs me the wrong way. Back when he and Mary Jane had just dated a while and shortly after Gwen died, maybe, I totally buy Peter's perfect life has everyone he blames himself for getting killed in it. Gwen and Uncle Ben are both still alive in this reality, and they should be. But it reads like a stunt, a loophole to finally put Gwen back on the page again and freak out an audience that never thought she'd be brought back to life, apart from that time she got cloned. Remember, this is a long time before Spider-Gwen. She was thought of as nigh untouchable at this time, like Jason Todd during Hush, when his resurrection was teased and then didn't happen. You know, yet. Peter's perfect life is a great idea on paper. He gets to essentially be the responsible person losing Ben and becoming Spider-Man made him, but without the sacrifices, and he gets the fame and fortune he's ignored in his previous life. He gets to have his cake and eat it too. At least, that's how it seems if you only read the main series. He's America's favorite superhero, he has no problems to speak of, he's a rich bald guy, cause you gotta be bald if you're rich in a comic book, and when he gets his memories back, he's more tortured than we've ever seen him. Like, he can hardly live with himself. And again, we're so distanced from him, and he's practically delirious. Seriously, this is about as whiny and self-absorbed as I've ever seen Spider-Man, which is wild coming from Bendis. I'm not entirely sure why he's reacting this way. We know Peter is disturbed by the notion that Mary Jane is more successful without him, and I'd maybe sympathize with him if he was angry with himself for picking Gwen over his wife, and then he has to come to grips with the idea that she'd be better off without him to boot, but I mean, only marginally. She's pretty successful with him around. I guess I don't know what exactly Mary Jane's status quo is right before House of M, but maybe that's an okay trade-off. She gets to be with the man of her dreams, and because she has a marriage and other responsibilities, she's not the movie star she could have been. She's only kind of famous. Like, that's a trade-off she would probably take, right? But Peter doesn't really talk about how he feels about Gwen, and so all we have to go on is his lamenting about that and his flashbacks to all the horrors in his original life. So is he practically losing it because he wants this life to be real so badly? He doesn't do anything to try to keep it, even when Kitty and Jessica throw out reasons not to change reality back. Or is he mad at himself for the life his subconscious chose? Or can he just not stand his mind suddenly being flooded with all the raw deals he's been dealt? It's probably supposed to be that, but I'm not totally sure. At the end, Peter screams at Doctor Strange to erase his mind of the memories from the House of M reality, and I guess it's because it's too painful to know what his life might have been. What's endearing about Spider-Man is that he does the right thing regardless of the potential consequences to his person. He keeps getting beaten down, but he keeps doing the responsible thing. And yeah, I guess he's doing that here, but he just won't stop complaining about it. And that's not Peter Parker to me. Well, it's Peter Parker when he's written badly. He'll often ask, in good Spider-Man stuff, in internal monologue, if the universe is ever going to throw him a bone, if he's destined to never get what he wants. But he doesn't usually freak out on everyone else about it. That's the point of all the quippiness under the mask. It's a defense mechanism. And I'm not convinced this is the absolute most horrible thing he's ever been through. Remember that time he got buried alive by Kraven for days? Remember how much he whined about it? And it's not like other characters with traumatic pasts don't also suddenly get all those memories back here, and none of them act like a robot that can't compute all the data and is about to explode. Peter's characterization here borders on accidental parody. I get the whole Parker luck thing, and that he can never get a break, and that sucks, but he gets so woe is me here, it's really hard to feel anything for him. It's also impossible to reconcile what we're given about Spider-Man here with his tie-in miniseries. I haven't read every single issue and miniseries that ties into House of M, but I read this one because I couldn't get a great peg on Spider-Man in this book. Initially, I thought it was enlightening, and it seemed essential. And then it completely contradicts the main book, and I decided maybe the tie-ins don't matter as much as I thought they might. I'm not going to do a full review of Wade's mini here, but the idea there is that Peter is passing as a mutant in order to achieve his fame as a public superhero and businessman, and so that his family, a bunch of lowly sapiens, can reap the benefits of being related to a beloved mutant, which we're not even given a hint of in the main series. Nobody talks about him as a mutant there. And it's kind of a tough pill to swallow. In a society where humans don't have the same basic rights mutants do, it's hard to buy there aren't blood tests and that everyone wouldn't know if you're a human. You know, maybe the humans could walk around with like big H's on their foreheads, like the M's the mutants have to wear in Days of Future Past. And can't the Royal Sentinels tell? So anyway, this Peter doesn't seem to be both responsible and famous. He's intentionally bullying his employee, J. Jonah Jameson, using him as a punching bag just because he can, and justifying it to himself by paying him a fortune. Why does House of M throw Spider-Man so far under the bus? Jameson gets his hands on Peter's personal journal, where he was stupid enough to write that he's actually a sapien. Jameson makes this public knowledge, and his whole world crumbles around him, like a beloved actor in, say, the 1970s being outed as gay or something. He ultimately ends up faking his own death and moving his family to a private island where they live happily ever after. And none of that stuff has happened to Peter at the point where he gets his memories back in House of M. So is this like a what if inside of what's essentially an in-universe what if? Because the world hasn't turned against him and he hasn't faked his own death by the end. And I might understand his reaction when he gets his memories back more if this was the person he was supposed to be. Wade's version of Peter's perfect life casts him as kind of an a-hole. It's like that Minnie can't tell the difference between a fantasy life for Peter and what might have happened if the timeline were altered. Wade's version implies that Peter can't be happy if he's not also miserable. Or put another way, that Peter can't be happy. He's always got to be guilty about something, and it's always got to be in the pursuit of trying to do the right thing for other people. In this case, taking care of his family. Which is an interesting take, but it's not fleshed out in the main series, and this completely contradicts the series, so it's hard to even consider it legitimate supplemental material. The main series doesn't have enough real estate to explore the world as much as I'd like, but some of the material designed to flesh it out doesn't seem to really mesh with it, so it's awkward. I don't think this premise lends itself great to this format. This should have been like Age of Apocalypse, a longer story that's told through multiple titles, where this alternate universe is the status quo in those books for a while. Or, as I suggested earlier, the focus could have been on one protagonist, and then we explore the most interesting aspects of this world through that person's eyes. But I still imagine that story would have warranted a few more issues. I've been dancing all around the main issue I have with this story, and as I alluded to at the beginning, that's that there are two premises here that are at odds. They both sort of work together, and there's a good case made for it at the end, but I constantly have this nagging feeling that if only we'd picked one or the other, it wouldn't feel as contrived. I think perhaps this should have been either everyone gets their perfect life, or what if Magneto got his way? I realize that if Magneto is going to be one of the characters who gets his personal utopia, he's going to dominate. But then maybe leave him out of it, because it creates a lot of head-scratching choices and puts characters in places that vilify them unnecessarily. I like the thematic idea of Pietro and Wanda trying to make everyone happy, and how that's impossible, because what everyone wants is so different, there's no reconciling all of them at once. And so the solution to the dilemma at the beginning ends up doing something that makes nobody happy, but makes it so that she doesn't have to get killed. But I don't think too much would have been lost from this story if it were simplified to just giving Magneto what he wants. What if Pietro just made it about unifying his family, giving them their utopia, and letting all the other pieces fall where they most naturally would, like in a what-if story? And then when Wanda blames Magneto and the existence of mutants at large for why their utopia doesn't work out, we're just exploring whether Magneto is right about the kind of world he thinks it should be, instead of mixing in everybody else's perfect lives as well. The book also can't decide how bad life is for humans under the House of M. Sometimes it feels like humans are just widely considered inferior to mutants, and that systematic racism affects their ability to get ahead in life, but there also seem to be laws in place that discriminate and oppress humans. The book doesn't always seem to remember. I'm really at a loss when Jessica Drew says, "And who's being hurt here exactly?" As if the only people that matter in the world are the superheroes who got their perfect life. That's not just one character's crazy perspective either. In Kitty and Jessica, we have a mutant and a human suggesting that this world isn't much better off than the old one. And the main argument Wolverine throws at them isn't, but what about all the humans who are subjugated and treated a lot worse than mutants are, at least currently in the world we come from? It's just, well, obviously we can't leave things like they are, and you're idiots for even suggesting it. Even though there are anti-human sentinels, and Hank Pym isn't allowed to do any research that might come off politically incorrect, and democracy is dead, and things are bad enough Luke Cage has to lead a rebellion, There are places where Bendis seems to suggest that this is just the same status quo as mutant prejudice, but flipped. And it's not. The last issue confirms that there are no anti-mutant laws in the books. I mean, in the regular universe. The government, at least, isn't oppressing mutants. Sure, there's racism, there's social injustice, and it's probably way worse for mutants than it is for the most prejudiced minorities in America in our world. But it's not an equal injustice to what's happening to humans. And don't forget, humans are dying here. When mutants are wiped out, they don't die, they just lose what makes them mutants. Which is a tragedy and a catastrophe, and I wouldn't take that away from people who identify themselves as mutants. But it's not the same thing as most of the individuals of a race actually dying. Especially because part of Magneto's perfect world seems to be mutants literally being the next step in human evolution and regular people dying out and becoming a minority. That doesn't happen naturally because it's not the pre-House of M status quo. In that reality, Magneto seems to be right. Mutants are objectively superior because natural selection is doing away with humanity. His perfect world seems to have allowed him to change science. Unless the implication is that humans are secretly being killed by his regime, but we're not told that. It might be in one of the tie-ins I haven't looked at, but from those I have read, things seem way worse for Sapiens than they are in the main book. There's talk in the SpiderMan mini about humans being locked up just for being human. But even forgetting that, because again, that doesn't even read as being in the same universe as this completely to me, it's ludicrous for anyone who doesn't hate humans as much as Magneto to act like maybe everything is fine and there's no good reason to put reality back, especially because of the basic principle of the situation. If you do that, you're letting one mutant destroy the basic ideals of freedom and the pursuit of happiness for his own ends. And you're letting another one be God because she killed some of your friends and nobody knew what to do with her. That's all terrifying, and it's not given the weight it should. Before we get to my score, let's find out what some of the folks at the Secret Superhero Screen Society have to say about this story with some tweet-linked reviews. First of all, Malik Myers, I have a hard time deciding if House of M is actually a good story or not, but much like Civil War, I think the MCU could greatly improve this story, whether you love it or hate it. Ultimately, I'm very conflicted about the story itself, but I love the MCU version of Wanda, and I'm eager to see if and how this storyline will be adapted. Ed S. House of M is awful, an event that exists to destroy characters and story, an event that gave a taste of how Bendis will kill the X-Men. Thomas Edgehill, a story about a child's love and regret. It asks the philosophical question, if you have the power to make everyone happy, do you have the right to? Could have been a bit longer, kinda just ends. 2.5 out of 4. And finally, Kareem Roberts says, among Bendis' opuses, right up there with Daredevil and Alias, he manages to hook his claws into the mutant Marvel mythos and honor what came before it. The haunts of House of M are still somewhat being felt, even in Hickman's current run of the X-Men. So quite an array of diverse opinions there. There's a lot of fascinating stuff to think about here. I love the somber atmosphere of this book. I love how unnerving it often is. I love the risks Bendis takes in allowing a major superhero to have a break from reality and to realize the nightmare that a powerful mutant might not be able to control her powers and could have to be killed. And not like the Phoenix with an alien influence magnifying her powers, but a person who isn't of sound mind, lashing out and changing reality itself. Even if I think it's arrived to in a clunky way, I like the consequences of Magneto getting his way being the near end of mutant kind. And I really appreciate the discussion of whether mutants should be considered human beings who are genetically different from other people or another race entirely, and the ethical implications of either way of looking at that. But it reads gimmicky and plot-driven in a way I don't think it would if the structure were more traditional and if events were presented entirely linearly, and it desperately needs a central protagonist. I'm giving House of M a 2.5 out of 4.